Imagine you're walking down a dirt road in Boston, Massachusetts in the year 1650. The sun has just set and shadows stretch across the narrow streets. Suddenly, you hear shouting, "A theft in progress." Your first instinct, call the police, but wait, there are no police. No squad cars, no badges, no 911 to dial. So who do you call? The answer might surprise you yourself. In colonial America, law enforcement wasn't a profession, it was a civic duty. There were no uniformed officers patrolling the streets, no detective bureaus investigating crimes, no police academies training recruits. Instead, ordinary farmers, merchants, and craftsmen took turns watching the streets at night, chasing down criminals, and maintaining order in their communities. But who were these reluctant enforcers of justice? How did a blacksmith or a tavern keeper suddenly become responsible for catching murderers and thieves? And perhaps most importantly, did this ragtag system actually work? Today, we're peeling back the layers of colonial law enforcement to reveal a world where everyone was the police, and the police were everyone. Let's dive in. Historical context and background. To understand who enforced the law in colonial America, we must first understand the world these colonists inherited. When English settlers began arriving on North American shores in the early 1600s, they brought with them centuries of English legal tradition, but not the infrastructure to support it. The English legal heritage. The English system that colonists knew was built on ancient foundations dating back to medieval times. The Statute of Winchester, enacted in 1285 by King Edward I, established key principles that would cross the Atlantic. The hue and cry system requiring all citizens to pursue criminals, the night watch system for urban protection, and the office of constable as a part-time community position. These weren't professional law enforcement innovations. They were community obligations encoded into law. By the 1600s, England had sheriffs who maintained order in counties, constables who served warrants and kept the peace in towns, and justices of the peace who served as local magistrates. But even in England, there was no professional police force. That innovation wouldn't arrive until Sir Robert Peel established the Metropolitan Police in London in 1829, nearly 2 centuries after Jamestown was founded. Adapting to the colonial reality. When colonists established settlements in the harsh American wilderness, they faced unique challenges that their English ancestors never encountered. Communities were small, isolated, and vulnerable. The nearest settlement might be days away by horseback. Communication was slow. Resources were scarce. And the threats were constant, not just from crime, but from starvation, disease, hostile Native American tribes, and the unforgiving environment itself. In this context, formal law enforcement was a luxury these communities couldn't afford. Every able-bodied man was needed for farming, building, and defense. There was no surplus population to create a standing police force. Law enforcement had to be woven into the fabric of daily life rather than separated as a distinct profession. The 4 pillars of colonial law enforcement. Colonial America developed 4 primary institutions for maintaining order, all adapted from English precedents but modified for frontier conditions. First, the constable. Typically elected or appointed annually, constables were ordinary citizens who took on law enforcement duties while maintaining their regular occupations. A constable might be a farmer on Monday, serve a warrant on Tuesday, and return to plowing his fields on Wednesday. The position was unpaid or minimally compensated, and in many colonies, eligible men were required to serve when called upon. It was considered a civic duty, like jury service or militia membership. Second, the night watch. Established first in Boston in 1631, then spreading to other colonial cities, the night watch consisted of citizens who patrolled streets from sunset to sunrise. Watchmen looked for fires, monitored suspicious activity, and raised alarms when trouble arose. Service was mandatory for property-owning men, though the wealthy could pay substitutes to take their place, creating an early class division in law enforcement. Third, The sheriff. The most powerful law enforcement figure in colonial society, sheriffs, a term derived from shire reeve, held jurisdiction over entire counties. They executed court orders, managed jails, collected taxes, and could deputize ordinary citizens to form posses for pursuing criminals or maintaining order. The sheriff was usually appointed by the colonial governor and held significant political and social authority. Fourth, the community itself. Perhaps most importantly, every colonist was expected to participate in law enforcement through the hue and cry system. If you witnessed a crime or heard someone calling for help, you were legally obligated to join the pursuit of criminals. Refusing to respond could result in fines or punishment. This collective responsibility meant that law enforcement was truly everyone's business. The legal framework. These law enforcement figures operated within a colonial legal system that was similarly informal by modern standards. Justices of the peace and magistrates, often wealthy landowners or respected community leaders with no legal training, presided over courts, determined guilt or innocence, and imposed sentences. Trials were swift, lawyers were rare, and punishments were public and often harsh. This was the framework that maintained order across colonial America for over 150 years, a patchwork system built on community obligation rather than professional expertise, on social pressure rather than formal institutions. Now let's see how it actually worked in practice. Case study/real-life examples. To truly understand who enforced the law in colonial America, we need to examine specific cases that reveal how these ordinary citizens became judges, juries, and executioners. Let's walk through several detailed examples that bring this system to life. Case Study 1. The Boston Night Watch and the Great Fire of 1653. On a cold January night in 1653, Boston's night watch was making its rounds through the sleeping town. The watch consisted of 4 men that night: a carpenter, a merchant's assistant, a baker, and a young apprentice. None were trained law enforcement officers. They were simply citizens fulfilling their mandatory duty, armed with lanterns, clubs, and a wooden rattle to sound alarms. Around 2 a.m. one watchman noticed an orange glow coming from the direction of the marketplace. Within moments, he was turning his rattle, a loud, distinctive noise that echoed through the narrow streets. The sound served 2 purposes. It alerted the other watchmen and awakened the townspeople. What followed demonstrates how law enforcement and community response were inseparable in colonial America. The watchmen didn't just report the fire and wait for firefighters. There were no firefighters. Instead, they immediately began organizing the response. They pounded on doors, shouting for men to bring buckets. They directed residents to form bucket brigades from the nearby wells. They identified which buildings should be torn down to create fire breaks. Within minutes, the town constable, John Woolrich, appeared. Despite being roused from sleep, Woolrich took command of the situation. He deputized additional men on the spot, assigning some to fight the fire, others to guard abandoned homes against looting, and still others to evacuate families from threatened houses. The fire burned for 3 hours before being contained. 3 buildings were destroyed, but much of the town was saved, not by a professional fire department or police force, but by the night watch and an impromptu organization of citizens led by a constable who was a sailmaker by trade. This incident illustrates several key aspects of colonial law enforcement. The watchmen were the eyes and ears of the community, the constable was a coordinator rather than a specialist, and every citizen was expected to respond to emergencies. Law enforcement was fundamentally about community mobilization rather than professional intervention. Case Study 2. Sheriff Samuel Willis and the Hartford Horse Thief Ring, 1664. In 1664, Hartford, Connecticut faced a growing problem: organized horse theft. Horses were extraordinarily valuable in colonial America. A good horse could cost as much as a year's wages for a laborer. They were essential for transportation, farming, and commerce. Losing a horse could devastate a family's economy. Samuel Willis, sheriff of Hartford County, began receiving reports that horses were disappearing from farms at night. Unlike cattle, which moved slowly and left obvious trails, horses could be ridden far away quickly. This was sophisticated crime requiring an equally sophisticated response. Willis was a wealthy landowner and magistrate, educated, connected, and respected. But he had no detective training, no forensic tools, and no police force to deploy. What he did have was authority, community connections, and the power to deputize citizens. Willis began his investigation by interviewing victims and examining the scenes where horses were taken. He noticed patterns. Horses were stolen during new moons when darkness was greatest, always from farms on the outskirts of town, and always animals of medium quality. Not the most expensive thoroughbreds that would be noticed, but valuable working horses that could be sold without raising suspicion. His breakthrough came through community intelligence. A tavern keeper in a neighboring town mentioned to one of Willis's deputies that strangers had been selling horses at unusually low prices. Willis deputized a group of trusted men and sent them to neighboring colonies to investigate horse sales and gather information. This wasn't detective work as we know it. It was community networking elevated to an investigative level. Willis's deputies were farmers and merchants who could travel without arousing suspicion, ask questions in taverns, and report back what they learned. The investigation led to New Haven, where Willis discovered 3 men operating a horse theft ring. They would steal horses in Hartford, quickly transport them to New Haven about 40 miles away, change the brands, and sell them to unsuspecting buyers or ship them to other colonies. Now came the difficult part: apprehension. Willis had no jurisdiction in New Haven. He was sheriff of Hartford County, but he did have relationships with authorities there. He sent a detailed letter to New Haven's magistrates describing the evidence and requesting their assistance. The New Haven authorities arrested the 3 men and held them for trial. But here's where colonial law enforcement becomes even more interesting. Willis traveled to New Haven to testify at the trial, bringing several Hartford residents whose horses had been stolen to identify the animals. The trial was held before a panel of magistrates, no professional judges, just respected community members interpreting the law. The evidence was presented: testimony from victims, identification of the stolen horses, and testimony from witnesses who had seen the defendants with the animals. All 3 were convicted. Their punishment was severe: public whipping, branding on the hand with a T for thief, and banishment from Connecticut colony. The stolen horses were returned to their rightful owners, and the defendants were escorted to the colony border and warned never to return under penalty of death. This case reveals several critical aspects of colonial law enforcement. First, the sheriff was an investigator, but his methods relied entirely on community participation and relationships rather than forensic science or specialized training. Second, jurisdiction was flexible. Cooperation between colonies was based on personal relationships between officials rather than formal interagency agreements. Third, punishment was designed to be memorable and permanent. The branded hand would mark these men as thieves forever, protecting every community they entered. Fourth, there was no concept of rehabilitation. The colony simply expelled the problem. Case Study 3, The Deerfield Massacre and the Limits of Law Enforcement, 1704. Not all law enforcement efforts in colonial America dealt with ordinary crime. Sometimes, the men responsible for keeping the peace faced threats far beyond their capabilities. The night of February 29, 1704, in Deerfield, Massachusetts, dramatically illustrates the limitations of colonial law enforcement. Deerfield was a frontier town of about 300 people, located in the Connecticut River Valley near the contested border between English and French colonial territories. The town had a constable, a militia captain, and a night watch. But these citizens-turned-lawmen were about to face an enemy they were unprepared to handle. That night, the watch consisted of two men, Sergeant Benoni Stebbins and John Hawks. They patrolled the snow-covered streets, checking that the palisade gates were secured and watching for any unusual activity. But what they didn't know was that a force of about 300 French soldiers and Native American warriors had approached the town under cover of darkness. The raiders had waited for a night after a heavy snowstorm, when snow had drifted against the wooden palisade walls, allowing them to climb over without breaking down the gates. By the time Stebbins and Hawks realized something was wrong, it was too late. The raid was brutal. The attackers moved house to house, killing 56 colonists and taking 109 prisoners who would be marched to Canada in the dead of winter. The night watch, despite being at their posts, never had a chance. They were watchmen, not soldiers, citizens doing their civic duty, not professionals trained for warfare. The constable, Samuel Carter, tried to organize resistance but was killed in the initial assault. The militia captain, Jonathan Wells, managed to fortify the strongest house in town and hold off the attackers long enough for some residents to escape, but he too was eventually killed. This tragic event reveals a harsh truth about colonial law enforcement. The same people responsible for catching pickpockets and settling disputes were also expected to defend against military raids. There was no distinction between law enforcement, military defense, and civic duty. The night watch were simultaneously police officers, firefighters, and soldiers, and sometimes none of those roles adequately prepared them for the dangers they faced. The aftermath of the Deerfield massacre led to changes in how frontier towns approached security. More colonists were trained in military tactics. Watch duties were taken more seriously. Palisades were strengthened. But fundamentally, the system remained the same: ordinary citizens protecting their communities without professional support. Case Study 4. Constable Benjamin Fletcher and the Tavern Dispute, 1688, New York. Not all law enforcement drama involved violence or high stakes. Sometimes, the constable's job was about maintaining order in everyday disputes, and these cases reveal just how personal and immediate colonial justice could be. Benjamin Fletcher was the constable of New York City's East Ward in 1688. A shopkeeper by trade, Fletcher had reluctantly accepted the position after being elected by his neighbors. The job paid almost nothing and took him away from his business, but refusing would result in fines. One Saturday evening, Fletcher was at home with his family when a messenger arrived. There was a fight at Joe Henny's Van Brug's Tavern. Fletcher grabbed his constable's staff, a wooden rod that symbolized his authority, and hurried to the scene. When he arrived, he found chaos. Two groups of men were fighting, sailors from a recently arrived ship and local dock workers. The dispute had started over a card game, escalated to accusations of cheating, and erupted into violence. Furniture was broken, patrons were injured, and Van Brugg was desperately trying to protect his establishment. Fletcher was one man facing about 15 brawlers. He had no backup, no other officers to call, no police station to retreat to. His authority rested entirely on the respect of the community and the symbolic power of his office. Fletcher did what colonial constables had done for generations. He raised his staff and commanded everyone to stop in the name of the law. To our modern ears, this sounds almost comically inadequate. But in a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone, where reputation mattered enormously, and where civic duty was taken seriously, it often worked. The fighting paused. Fletcher identified the main instigators, two men who were clearly the most aggressive. He commanded them to come with him to the magistrate. When one refused, Fletcher didn't try to physically overpower him. Instead, he turned to the crowd and, invoking the hue and cry, commanded all present to assist him in apprehending the lawbreaker. This moment reveals the genius of the colonial system. Fletcher didn't need to be physically capable of subduing criminals himself. The community was his police force. When he invoked the hue and cry, every man present was legally obligated to help. Refusing would result in fines and social ostracism. Several men stepped forward and restrained the resistant fighter. Fletcher then marched both men to the home of the local magistrate, Stephanus Van Cortlandt, where an impromptu hearing was held that very night. Van Cortlandt, who had been preparing for bed, heard the case in his night clothes. There were no lawyers, no formal procedures, no written briefs. Fletcher presented what had happened, the accused gave their side, and Van Brugge testified about the damage to his tavern. Van Cortlandt's judgment was swift. Both men would spend 3 days in the stocks at the public square, pay restitution to Van Brugge for damages, and post bond for good behavior. If they couldn't pay, they'd be whipped instead. This case demonstrates how law enforcement worked at its most routine level in colonial America. A part-time constable responding to everyday disorder, using community pressure rather than force, bringing offenders before a magistrate who exercised broad discretionary power, and imposing immediate public punishment. Social impact and analysis. The colonial law enforcement system profoundly shaped American society in ways that resonate even today. Understanding its social impact requires examining both its strengths and its troubling weaknesses. Community cohesion and civic duty. The requirement that every citizen participate in law enforcement created a deep sense of collective responsibility for public order. When you might be called upon at any moment to chase a criminal, serve on a jury, or patrol the streets at night, you had a personal investment in preventing crime. This wasn't an abstract concept, it was your immediate reality. This system strengthened community bonds in small, cohesive settlements. Everyone knew their neighbors. Reputation mattered enormously. Being known as someone who shirked their watch duty, refused the hue and cry, or caused trouble at the tavern could have severe social and economic consequences. In a world where most business was conducted face-to-face and trust was essential, social pressure was remarkably effective at maintaining order. The colonists developed a civic culture that emphasized duty, participation, and mutual protection. These values would later influence the revolutionary generations thinking about citizenship, self-governance, and resistance to tyranny. The idea that government derives its power from the people wasn't just political philosophy, it was lived experience in law enforcement. The dark side, inequality and abuse. But this community-based system had serious flaws, particularly around issues of equality and justice. Wealthy colonists could avoid watch duty by paying substitutes, usually poor men who needed the money. This meant law enforcement was literally divided by class. The rich paid to avoid the burden, while the poor bore it. Over time, the night watch in larger cities became staffed primarily by the elderly, the poor, and those who couldn't afford substitutes, hardly an effective crime prevention force. The system was also deeply inequitable across racial and ethnic lines. Enslaved Africans had no rights within this system and were subject to special slave patrols in southern colonies, armed groups of white men who terrorized black communities, hunted runaways, and enforced brutal slave codes. Free black people, Native Americans, and other minority populations received harsher treatment and had little recourse when victimized. Women were excluded from law enforcement roles entirely and had limited access to legal protection. Domestic violence was often ignored unless it became public scandal. Women couldn't serve as constables, watchmen, or jurors, and their testimony in court was valued less than men's. The danger of arbitrary power. The colonial system concentrated enormous discretionary power in the hands of constables, sheriffs, and magistrates, who were often the same people who held economic and political power. This created opportunities for favoritism, corruption, and the weaponization of law enforcement against personal enemies or political rivals. Because magistrates had no legal training and operated with minimal oversight, justice could vary wildly. What constituted sufficient evidence in one town might be dismissed in another. Punishments for identical crimes could range from minor fines to brutal whippings depending on the magistrate's mood, personal relationship with the defendant, or political considerations. The lack of formal legal protections meant innocent people could be convicted based on rumor, prejudice, or coerced confessions. The Salem witch trials of 1692 remain the most infamous example, but countless smaller injustices occurred throughout colonial America when community hysteria or powerful individuals targeted vulnerable people. The problem of professionalization. As colonial towns grew into cities, the limitations of the citizen-based system became increasingly apparent. In larger populations, anonymity replaced community cohesion. Crime increased with density and economic inequality. The night watch proved inadequate. Watchmen were often elderly, drunk, or asleep at their posts. The voluntary part-time nature of colonial law enforcement worked in small settlements where everyone knew everyone. But in places like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, which had populations in the tens of thousands by the mid-1700s, the system was breaking down. More sophisticated criminals could exploit the gaps. Organized crime emerged. And ordinary citizens increasingly resented the burden of unpaid law enforcement duty. These pressures would eventually lead to professionalization, but that transformation wouldn't come until the 19th century. Modern connections, reflection. The ghost of colonial law enforcement haunts modern American policing in surprising ways. Understanding these connections helps us see both how far we've come and how some fundamental tensions remain unresolved. Community policing. Back to the future. Over the past several decades, American law enforcement has increasingly embraced community policing as an ideal. The concept emphasizes police officers building relationships with communities, knowing residents personally, and working collaboratively to solve problems rather than simply responding to 911 calls. Sound familiar? In many ways, community policing is an attempt to recapture elements of the colonial system, the personal relationships, local knowledge, and shared responsibility, while avoiding its weaknesses. Modern community policing programs encourage officers to walk beats, attend neighborhood meetings, and engage with residents as partners rather than adversaries. Neighborhood watch programs take this even further, explicitly asking citizens to be the eyes and ears of law enforcement, almost a direct echo of the colonial hue and cry system. At their best, these programs create the kind of collective investment in public safety that characterized colonial communities. But the parallel also reveals concerning patterns. Just as colonial watchmen sometimes targeted social outsiders, modern neighborhood watch programs have been criticized for racial profiling. The 2012 shooting of Trayvon Martin by neighborhood watch volunteer George Zimmerman sparked national outrage and revealed how community self-policing without proper oversight, training, and accountability can go tragically wrong. The professionalization paradox. Colonial America had no professional police because the entire community was responsible for law enforcement. Modern America has highly professionalized police forces, but this specialization has created an us versus them mentality that colonial systems, for all their flaws, didn't have. When the constable is your neighbor, when the sheriff is someone you elect locally, when you might serve on the night watch yourself, law enforcement feels like something we do together. When police are a separate, professionalized force with distinct uniforms, military equipment, and institutional culture, they can feel like an occupying army rather than community members. This paradox drives many modern reform debates. Should we have more professional training and higher standards for police, moving further from the colonial model? Or should we emphasize local accountability and community connection, moving closer to it? The answer isn't obvious. The question of authority and accountability. Colonial constables and sheriffs derived their authority from the community. They were elected or appointed locally, and they lived among the people they policed. Modern police derive authority from government institutions that can feel distant and unaccountable. Recent movements demanding police accountability, transparency, and community oversight are, in a sense, asking to return to a principle the colonists understood. Those who enforce the law should be accountable to those they serve. Body cameras, civilian review boards, and local control of police departments are modern mechanisms attempting to achieve what colonial communities had naturally: direct accountability. However, we must also remember the dangers of purely local control. Colonial justice was frequently mob justice. Unpopular minorities had no protection from community prejudice. There were no constitutional rights, no professional standards, no appeals to higher authority when local power was abused. The civic duty question. Perhaps the most profound difference between colonial and modern law enforcement is the concept of civic duty. Colonial Americans understood that maintaining order was everyone's responsibility. Modern Americans generally view public safety as something police do for us, not with us. This shift has both benefits and costs. Professional police can develop expertise that amateurs lack. Specialization creates efficiency. But it also absolves citizens of personal responsibility for their community's safety and well-being. Some modern reforms try to bridge this gap. Civilian emergency response teams, violence interruption programs, and restorative justice initiatives that involve community members in addressing crime and harm. These approaches acknowledge that perhaps the colonists understood something important. A safe community requires everyone's participation, not just professionals. The universal tension. Both colonial and modern systems struggle with the same fundamental tension. How do we maintain order while protecting liberty? How do we give law enforcement enough power to be effective without enabling tyranny? How do we balance community safety with individual rights? The colonists answer: universal civic duty within small, cohesive communities worked for a time but proved inadequate as society grew more complex. Our modern answer: professionalized police forces operating within constitutional constraints, has achieved much but faces its own crisis of legitimacy. Perhaps the lesson is that there is no perfect system, but understanding how our ancestors approached these problems, what worked, what failed, and why, can inform our ongoing struggle to create law enforcement that is both effective and just. Conclusion and call to action. So, who enforced the law in colonial America? The answer is simultaneously simple and profound: everyone and no one. There were no police officers as we understand them today. Instead, there was a patchwork system of part-time constables who were shopkeepers and farmers, reluctant watchmen who patrolled streets at night while dreaming of their beds, sheriffs who wielded enormous power across vast territories, and magistrates who dispensed justice from their own homes with no legal training. But most importantly, there was the community itself. Every citizen legally obligated to respond to the hue and cry, chase down criminals, serve on juries, and bear collective responsibility for public order. Law enforcement wasn't a profession. It was a civic duty woven into the fabric of daily life. We've seen this system at its best. The Boston Night Watch preventing catastrophic fire, Sheriff Willis methodically investigating the horse theft ring, Constable Fletcher maintaining order through community authority rather than force. We've also seen its worst: the Deerfield watchmen overwhelmed by threats they couldn't handle, the unequal burden that fell on the poor, the arbitrary power of magistrates, and the countless injustices inflicted on marginalized communities. This history matters because it shaped fundamental American attitudes about law, order, and citizenship. The revolutionary generation, raised in this system, understood governance as participatory rather than imposed from above. Their resistance to British tyranny was partly informed by their experience of local, community-based law enforcement. They rejected distant authority precisely because they were accustomed to handling their own affairs. The colonial system also revealed eternal tensions that remain unresolved. How do we balance effectiveness with liberty? How do we ensure accountability while granting necessary authority? How do we protect minorities from majority tyranny? How do we maintain order without creating a police state? Modern America has chosen a very different path: professional police forces, constitutional protections, formal legal procedures, and specialized expertise. We've solved many problems the colonists faced. We've also created new ones they never imagined. As we debate police reform, community policing, accountability, and the proper role of law enforcement in a free society, we're not having a new conversation. We're continuing one that began in those early colonial settlements where ordinary citizens became reluctant guardians of order. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Do you think the colonial model of citizen-based law enforcement has lessons for us today? Could elements of that system, universal civic duty, local accountability, community participation, improve modern policing? Or would returning to those principles create more problems than it solves? What do you think was the most surprising aspect of colonial law enforcement? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read everyone and love discussing these historical questions with you. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of American law enforcement, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're exploring how the systems we take for granted today came to be, revealing the strange, fascinating, and sometimes shocking truths hidden in history. Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding how we got here and where we might go next. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the stories that shaped our world.